Most fans think they already know every secret SpongeBob SquarePants has to offer. From deleted scenes to banned episodes everyone loves to repeat online. But one name keeps surfacing across leaked storyboards, forgotten tapes, and quiet contradictions between the people who actually made the show. In this video, we break down every lost SpongeBob theory, the SpongeBoy Ahoy theory, the show that almost wasn't. SpongeBob. Before SpongeBob SquarePants became one of the biggest cartoons ever made, it almost had a different name, a different lead voice recording, and a different opening line of dialogue that most fans have never heard. A full episode was recorded, animated planning began, and then, right before the show could move forward, the entire project had to change its main character's name. That change is not a rumor, it is documented, but the actual audio recording from before the change happened is considered lost, and it may never surface again. The story starts long before any cartoon existed. A man named Steven Hillenburg spent years teaching marine biology to visitors at a place called the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California, back in the 1980s. He loved the ocean deeply, and he wanted to teach people about it in a way that felt fun instead of boring. So he made his own educational comic book to use in his classes. That comic book was called The Intertidal Zone. It was never sold in stores. It was made just for his students, to help explain sea creatures and tide pools in a way that stuck in people's memory. Inside that unpublished comic book lived a character named Bob the Sponge. But here's something most people do not expect. Bob was not the star of the story. He was a small character, more like a narrator or an announcer who popped in to explain things to the reader. He was background. He was a tool for teaching, not a hero people were supposed to fall in love with. Years later, after working as a director on a different cartoon called Rocko's Modern Life, Hillenburg decided he wanted to build his own show. He returned to his old teaching material and began shaping it into something new. That is when Bob the Sponge stopped being a background helper and became the main character of an entire series. Hillenburg took this quiet teaching tool and turned him into the emotional center of a brand new show. When it came time to bring this character to life with a real voice, Hillenburg turned to someone he already trusted. Tom Kenny had worked alongside him back on Rocko's Modern Life, and the two of them already had a creative shorthand built from years of working together. Kenny had used a certain voice for a small side character back on that older show, and Hillenburg remembered it clearly. When he came calling with the idea for this new Sponge character, Kenny had actually forgotten how he made that voice in the first place. So Hillenburg pulled up an old clip from Rocko's Modern Life and played it back for him, just to remind him what it sounded like. Kenny heard it, found the voice again, and that became the voice fans know today. During the early planning stage, before any studio executives were even involved, the creative team would get together on weekends just to build ideas. They used something as simple as a tape recorder to capture jokes, voices, and concepts as they came up. Kenny would test out lines using the sponge voice, while Hillenburg jumped between voicing the other characters himself, just to see how conversations between them might sound. This was not a polished writer's room with cameras and lighting. It was a small group of friends bouncing ideas off each other, recording bits on tape, trying to find the right feeling for a world that did not exist yet. Here is where the theory that fans still talk about begins. During all of this early development, the character everyone was building did not have the name SpongeBob at all. He was called SpongeBoy, and the show itself was not going to be called SpongeBob SquarePants. It was going to be called SpongeBoy Ahoy. The character had no last name yet either. He was just SpongeBoy, plain and simple. A sponge with a job and a personality, but without the family name that fans now know by heart. Everything moved forward under that name. The team wrote scripts. They built out a full pilot episode, meant to be the very first taste of the show that Nickelodeon executives would see and judge. This pilot ran about 7 minutes long, which was a perfect length to fit into the kind of programming blocks Nickelodeon was using at the time. The voice acting for this pilot was fully recorded. Every character had lines. Every joke had a performance behind it. This was not a rough sketch or a scribbled idea. It was treated as complete enough that it could have aired as an actual episode of a real show. When it was shown to people at Nickelodeon, the reaction was strong. The idea worked. The character worked. The whole concept felt ready to become something bigger than a pitch sitting in a drawer. But then something happened behind the scenes that had nothing to do with jokes, animation, or story. It had to do with paperwork. Nickelodeon's legal department did what legal departments do, which is check whether a name is already being used somewhere else. And they found a problem. The name SpongeBoy, according to what the show's staff and Nickelodeon's own corporate side have said publicly, was already tied to an existing product. product. The commonly repeated version of the story says it was a mop, a cleaning mop, using the same name already sitting on shelves somewhere, already legally claimed by another company. If that was true, using the same name for a cartoon character could create a legal mess that nobody wanted to deal with. This is the part where the story gets more interesting than a simple name swap. For years, fans and even members of the crew treated the mop story as fact. Tom Kenny himself has mentioned the mop explanation in interviews, but when people started digging deeper, looking for actual proof that a SpongeBoy mop ever existed on store shelves in the 1990s, they came up empty. No packaging, no advertisement, no trace of a mop by that name ever being sold anywhere. What investigators did find instead was a business that used the name SpongeBoy on one of its products, but it was not a mop company. It was linked to an old, no longer operating pencil company. That is a strange twist for a story that has been repeated for years using the mop version. It raises a real possibility that even the people who lived through the name change may have slightly misremembered where the conflict actually came from, mixing up the specific product while remembering correctly that some kind of trademark problem existed. Whether it was a mop or a pencil-related product almost does not matter for the bigger picture. Both versions agree on the important part. The name SpongeBoy could not be used because someone else already owned it. So the crew had a decision to make. They needed a new name for their main character, and they needed one fast, since the whole concept, the whole show, and the whole main character's identity depended on getting this right before moving into full production. Hillenburg had a personal rule he wanted to follow while picking the replacement name. He felt strongly that the word sponge needed to stay somewhere in the name. His reasoning had nothing to do with branding tricks or marketing plans. He simply did not want people to look at this yellow, square, sea-dwelling character and mistake him for something completely different. Specifically, something people might confuse with a cheese-related mascot instead of a sea sponge. Keeping the word sponge in the name was his way of making sure nobody lost track of what this character actually was supposed to be. That is how the show landed on the name SpongeBob. It kept the required word, it sounded playful, it fit the tone the whole project was going for, but the character still needed something else. He needed a last name, since the original SpongeBoy version never had one to begin with. This next part of the story might be one of the most casual, offhand moments in the entire history of the show, and it happened almost by accident. Tom Kenny looked at a picture of the character and made an off-the-cuff comment, joking that here was a sponge wearing square pants who somehow thought he could land a job working at a fast food restaurant. It was meant as a throwaway joke about how the character looked, but something about it stuck. The words square pants fit perfectly with the character's actual shape, since he was already drawn as a literal rectangle wearing clothes. From that small joking comment, the last name SquarePants was born, completing the character's full name as fans know it today. So within a fairly short stretch of time, the show went from being called SpongeBoy Ahoy with a nameless lead character to being called SpongeBob SquarePants, a full name built from a legal requirement on one side and a joking comment on the other. Almost none of that naming journey was planned out in advance, the way most branding decisions usually are. It happened under pressure, quickly, in response to a legal problem nobody saw coming until the pilot was already fully recorded. Now here is where the lost media side of the story becomes just as important as the name change itself. That original 7-minute pilot, the one voiced entirely under the name SpongeBoy, still technically exists as a piece of history, but the actual audio recording of it has never been made available to the public in a complete confirmed form. For years, all that people outside the production team really had were rumors that this early version once existed. It was not until a 2006 interview with Tom Kenny that its existence was properly confirmed from someone who was actually there and actually recorded it. He confirmed, in his own words during that interview, that a full version of the pilot was voiced using the original name before everything changed. That confirmation mattered a lot to people who study old, hard-to-find pieces of television history, because it moved the SpongeBoy pilot from being just a rumor into being a confirmed, real thing that once existed and was never properly released. The actual sound of that pilot, the actual voice work, the actual jokes, as they were performed under the original name, remains missing from public view. It is not proven to be destroyed. It is simply not out there for anyone to to hear in full. What has become available, much later and only in pieces, are visual records instead of audio ones. In late August of 2022, storyboards connected to this very early version of the show were leaked online. Storyboards are basically the visual blueprint used before animation happens, showing roughly what each scene should look like and how the story should flow from moment to moment. Having these storyboards out in public gives historians and fans something concrete to study. It shows how the earliest version of this world was drawn, staged, and paced, even without being able to hear how it originally sounded when voiced under the SpongeBob name. Taken all together, this gives a fuller and much more textured picture of how close the entire franchise came to being something slightly different than what eventually reached television screens everywhere. If that early trademark conflict had never come up, an entire generation might have grown up watching SpongeBob Ahoy instead of SpongeBob SquarePants. The character might never have received the exact last name that has since become part of everyday language for millions of people. The jokes, the personality, the voice performance by Tom Kenny, all of that likely would have carried over in some form, regardless of the name. But the specific title, the specific way people refer to this character in daily conversation, came from a legal accident and a joke about pants, not from careful months-long brand planning. It also says something interesting about how creative projects sometimes survive their own near misses. The team did not scrap the whole idea just because of a naming problem. They adapted quickly, found a new name that still fit the character's core identity, and moved forward with barely any delay to the bigger plan. The heart of the character, his personality, his voice, his optimism, and his job working at a restaurant, all of that stayed exactly the same through the entire naming crisis. Only the outer label changed. This piece of history remains only partly documented today. The general story is confirmed through interviews, through Nickelodeon's own corporate statements over the years, and through Wikipedia-level detail drawn from those sources. The leaked storyboards give a visual record, but the actual voice recording, the sound of SpongeBob speaking his lines for the very first time, sits in an unclear space between confirmed to exist and fully lost to the public. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That naming story leaves one more thread hanging quietly in the background. Bikini Bottom borrows its name directly from a real place in the Pacific, with a very heavy history attached to it. That question would eventually reach the cast themselves, and their answers would end up contradicting each other almost a decade apart. Section 2. The Bikini Atoll Theory. Confirmed false, then confirmed true. Every kid who grew up watching SpongeBob SquarePants learned the name of the town before they learned much else about the show. Bikini Bottom sat at the center of every episode, a whole underwater world built from pineapples, rock houses, and buildings shaped like giant seashells. Almost nobody watching at age 6 or 7 stopped to ask where that name actually came from. But the name was never invented out of thin air. It was borrowed directly from a real place, and that real place carries one of the heaviest, strangest histories of the entire 20th century. Bikini Atoll is a real ring of small islands sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, part of a chain of islands called the Marshall Islands. For most of history, it was home to a small community living a quiet life built around fishing and the ocean around them. That quiet life ended in the years right after World War II, when the United States government chose Bikini Atoll as the site for a massive series of nuclear weapons tests. Starting in 1946, the American military moved the entire population off their own islands and began detonating nuclear bombs in the waters and skies above their home. Over the following years, dozens of these tests took place there, including one of the largest and most destructive nuclear explosions the United States ever set off on purpose, a test in 1954 known by the codename Castle Bravo. That explosion was so much bigger than expected that it spread radioactive fallout across a wide stretch of ocean, far beyond the safety zone the military had planned for, and it ended up harming people on nearby islands who were never supposed to be anywhere near the blast. The families who once lived on Bikini Atoll were told at the time that they would be able to return home eventually. That promise never really came true in the way they were told it would. Radiation levels on the islands stayed dangerously high for decades, and even now, generations later, questions still remain about whether it is fully safe for people to live there permanently again. It stands today as one of the clearest real-world examples of a place being sacrificed for weapons testing, with the people who called it home home, paying the price for decisions made far away from them. This piece of history is well documented and widely known outside of cartoons entirely. It shows up in history books, in nuclear policy discussions, and in the well-known fact that the swimsuit called the Bikini actually took its name from this same atoll, since the swimsuit's designer wanted a name that captured the same kind of shock and attention the nuclear tests had caused around the world. So by the time SpongeBob SquarePants picked the name Bikini Bottom for its underwater town, it was reaching directly into a real historical event that most adults already associated with nuclear weapons, radiation, and displaced communities. That overlap is exactly where a long-running fan theory took shape. If a cartoon show sets its entire cast of characters underwater, directly beneath a real place where multiple nuclear bombs were detonated throughout the 1940s and 1950s, then a natural question starts to form. Are the characters living in Bikini Bottom supposed to be understood as creatures that were changed by all that radiation? Is SpongeBob himself, along with Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and every other resident of that underwater world, meant to be read as some kind of mutated life form, shaped by decades of nuclear fallout sitting on the ocean floor above their heads? This is not a new idea that popped up recently. Fans have been asking versions of this question since not long after the show first premiered in 1999. Given how specific and real the location's history actually is, it felt like too big of a detail to be a coincidence. Kids show creators do not typically pick a real nuclear test site by accident when building an entire universe of talking sea creatures. The theory grew from that instinct, the sense that a detail this specific had to mean something more than simple world building. For a long stretch of time, this stayed exactly where most fan theories live, as a piece of internet discussion passed around without any real answer from the people who actually made the show. That changed in 2015 when Tom Kenny, the actor who has voiced SpongeBob since the very beginning, addressed the theory directly. He denied it. According to his statement at that time, the idea that the characters of Bikini Bottom were meant to be understood as mutants shaped by nuclear testing was not something the show intended. His answer, coming straight from the actor who has spent more time inside that character than anyone else alive, seemed like it should have settled the question for good. A creator or a lead voice actor denying a theory is usually treated by fans as close to the final word on the matter, since these are the people closest to the actual intentions behind the work. For almost a decade after that denial, the theory mostly quieted down. It never disappeared completely, since fan theories about long-running shows rarely vanish entirely, but it stopped being treated as a live, open question. Kenny's 2015 statement functioned as the closest thing to an official answer that existed, and most casual fans moved on from actively debating it. Then, in 2024, something happened that almost never happens with a settled fan theory. A different member of the show's cast spoke on the exact same question and gave a completely different answer. Mr. Lawrence, the actor who has voiced Plankton since the earliest seasons of the show, addressed the same theory directly. Instead of denying it the way Kenny had years earlier, Lawrence said the theory was true. He went further than simply confirming the basic idea, stating that the real-world nuclear testing history at Bikini Atoll had influenced other parts of the show as well, beyond just the general idea of mutated sea life. This creates a rare and genuinely unusual situation in the history of this franchise. Two people who have spent years working closely on the same show, both with direct access to its creative direction and its behind-the-scenes decisions, went on record with opposite answers to the exact same question, separated by roughly 9 years. This is not a case of one side being random fans arguing online, while the actual creative team stays silent. Both statements came from inside the production itself. One denied a very specific claim about the show's underlying concept. The other confirmed that same claim years later, and added new detail on top of it. There are a few different ways to think about why this kind of contradiction might happen, and it is worth walking through the honest possibilities rather than picking just one and presenting it as certain fact. It is possible that Kenny's 2015 denial reflected what he personally believed, or had been told at that point, based on his own understanding of the show's design, while Lawrence's 2024 statement reflected a different piece of internal knowledge that had not been shared publicly before that point. Voice actors are not always present for every conversation happening in the writer's room or in early design meetings, especially on a show that has run for over 2 decades, with plenty of staff changes across that time. It is also possible that the show's creative team never had one single, fixed, official position on this question at all, and different people involved with the production simply held different personal interpretations of what the setting was meant to represent. Either way, what makes this particular theory stand apart from most fan speculation is that it does not rely on guessing what an actor probably thinks, or reading between the lines of vague interview answers. Both statements are direct, both are on record, and both address the exact same claim using nearly identical language, just with completely opposite conclusions. That gives this theory a level of documented contradiction that most fan discussions about hidden meanings in cartoons simply do not have. It is also worth sitting with what this specific theory would actually mean for the show's tone, if taken seriously as an intended concept rather than just a background detail. SpongeBob SquarePants has always presented Bikini Bottom as a bright, colorful, cheerful place, full of jokes, silly jobs, and constant, simple fun. If the underlying concept was always meant to include the idea that every character living there exists because of nuclear fallout settling over their home for decades, that adds a strange layer sitting quietly underneath a show built almost entirely around lighthearted humor for children. It does not change any of the jokes themselves. It does not make any single episode read differently on its own, but it does add a layer of real-world weight sitting just beneath the surface of a place that most viewers have only ever experienced as a source of comfort and simple entertainment. This also connects back to something worth remembering about how the show came together in the first place. Steven Hillenburg built this entire underwater world using his real background as a marine science teacher, drawing directly from actual ocean life and actual locations for inspiration, rather than inventing everything from scratch. Given that pattern of pulling from real-world material throughout the show's creation, choosing a real, specific, historically loaded location like Bikini Atoll for the setting's name fits into a broader habit of building this fictional world out of real pieces rather than fully invented ones. Whether that specific piece was meant to carry its full historical weight, or whether the name was chosen simply because it sounded fitting for an ocean setting without carrying its full real-world meaning into the writer's room, remains the exact question that Kenny and Lawrence have now answered in two completely different ways. What makes this theory worth including here, among genuinely confirmed pieces of show history, is that unlike most fan speculation floating around online, this one does not require guessing about hidden meaning at all. Both sides of the disagreement are already spoken aloud, on record, by people who worked directly on the show. There is no need to read between the lines or search for hidden clues buried in old episodes. The contradiction itself is the confirmed fact. Two answers exist, both from inside the production, both addressing the same specific question, arriving at opposite conclusions 9 years apart. That gap between 2015 and 2024 also raises a smaller, quieter question of its own. It points toward how much can shift inside a long-running production over the better part of a decade. How different people involved with the same characters can end up holding different understandings of what those characters were always meant to represent underneath the surface. A show does not need a single, fixed answer to every question about its own design in order to keep running successfully for over 20 years. But it does mean that a question fans have been asking since 1999 still does not have one clean, agreed-upon answer, even now, even from the people who brought these characters to life in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next piece of unresolved history connects to something the show actually let its own audience help decide, rather than something buried quietly behind the scenes. Section 3. The lost alternate endings of You Wish. Long before shows regularly asked fans to vote on outcomes through phone apps or online polls, SpongeBob SquarePants tried something unusual back in 2001. Instead of simply airing a normal new episode and moving on to the next one, Nickelodeon built an entire television event around letting the audience decide how a story would end. The special was called You Wish, and it was built around the episode known as Shanghaied, which first aired on March 9th, 2001. For a show mostly known for silly jobs, jellyfish hunting, and a pink starfish who barely understands anything happening around him, this kind of interactive experiment stood out as something genuinely different from a normal Saturday morning cartoon. To understand how unusual this actually was, it helps to think about what television looked like at the time. In 2001, most households did not have smartphones. Nobody Nobody was voting through an app or texting a number on screen. If a network wanted to let its audience make a real decision about a broadcast, the only realistic option was the telephone sitting on the kitchen wall, or the one plugged into a bedroom outlet. That meant getting an entire audience of children and families to participate required real coordination. Kids had to convince a parent to let them use the house phone during a commercial break, dial in fast enough for the vote to count, and then sit back down in time to see the result play out live. That process alone made You Wish feel like an event rather than a normal episode airing on a normal night, since it asked something of the audience that a typical cartoon never did. The idea worked like this. During the episode, at a key turning point in the story, the show paused and asked the people watching at home to make a choice. Kids and families could call in during a commercial break using their home phones and vote for which ending they wanted to see play out. Once the votes were counted, the ending with the most support would air as the official conclusion to that broadcast, right there in front of everyone watching live. Whichever version won that night would go on to be treated as the real canon ending going forward, while the other options would fade into the background as versions almost nobody outside of that live broadcast ever got to see. 3 different endings existed for this event. One followed SpongeBob, one followed Squidward, one followed Patrick. Each version gave a different character the spotlight for how the story wrapped up, meaning the writing team had to prepare 3 separate, complete conclusions instead of just one, fully aware that 2 of those 3 would likely never be shown to the general public in a normal broadcast setting. That is already a fairly rare choice for any television show to make, since most productions only ever write one ending and move on. Writing 3 complete versions of the same story, animating all 3 in full, and paying for voice work across all 3 represents a real investment of time and money for outcomes the studio knew in advance would mostly go unseen. Most shows would never justify that kind of spending for something that gets used once and then set aside. The fact that Nickelodeon greenlit this approach says something about how much confidence the network had in the SpongeBob brand at this early stage in its run, since building an entire event around throwaway material is a risk most shows are never given room to take. When the votes were counted that night back in 2001, the SpongeBob ending won. From that point forward, this became the version everyone thinks of as the real ending to Shanghai. It is the version that has aired in reruns ever since. It is the version placed on basic home video collections and later on streaming platforms. For most people who have watched this episode at any point over the last 2 decades, this is simply the ending to the story, with no sign that anything else was ever an option. Anyone who did not personally sit through the original 2001 broadcast has essentially no reason to ever suspect that 2 other complete versions of this same story exist somewhere, since nothing about the version that plays in reruns hints at the fact that it was chosen by a vote instead of simply being the one and only ending the writers ever created. But the other 2 endings did not vanish completely. Squidward's ending and Patrick's ending both eventually found their way onto certain DVD box set releases down the line, giving collectors and dedicated fans a chance to see the 2 conclusions that lost the vote that night. This alone makes You Wish an interesting piece of television history, since very few shows ever let viewers see multiple official studio-produced endings to the same episode, instead of just a single canon version with maybe a deleted scene attached somewhere as a bonus feature. Deleted scenes are common enough on DVD releases across all kinds of shows and movies, usually presented as short clips that never made the final cut. Complete alternate endings, fully animated, fully voiced, and originally aired live on national television as legitimate broadcast options, sit in a different category entirely. This makes the DVD release of these 2 losing endings a genuinely unusual piece of preservation, since most networks would have simply let unused material like this disappear quietly, rather than packaging it for people to buy years later. Here is where the story becomes more complicated, and where the idea of lost media actually comes into play. The 3 endings were not simply 3 separate scenes bolted onto the same episode. Nickelodeon wrapped the entire event using its Patchy the Pirate framing device, a recurring host character used across several SpongeBob specials to introduce and narrate segments in a pirate ship setting, usually alongside his parrot sidekick, Potty. Patchy had already appeared in other SpongeBob specials by this point, functioning as a kind of live-action host, bridging the cartoon segments with real-world excitement and build-up, giving events like this one an extra layer of showmanship beyond just the animated content itself. For You Wish, Patchy appeared in between segments, setting up the choice for viewers and reacting to whichever ending had won. This meant that each of the 3 endings had its own matching wraparound segment featuring Patchy, built specifically to introduce and close out that particular version of the story. The role Patchy played here was not just decorative. He was the one explaining the stakes to the audience, building excitement before the vote, and delivering the actual announcement of which ending had won once the votes were tallied. Removing Patchy from the picture means removing the actual game show structure that made You Wish feel like a real event instead of a normal episode with an unusual gimmick attached. Without his hosting segments, the surviving alternate endings just look like 2 extra cartoon scenes sitting on a DVD, disconnected from the excitement and suspense that gave them meaning during the original broadcast. When the show moved from being a single live broadcast event into something packaged for home video and eventually for streaming, most of that original wraparound material simply did not make the trip. The SpongeBob ending kept its place as the main story, since it was the one everyone had already accepted as canon. But the 2 losing endings, when they did eventually appear on certain DVD releases, were included as more bare-bones alternate scenes, without the same full patchy wraparound treatment that originally aired live back in 2001. The introduction and reaction segments that Patchy performed specifically for Squidward's ending and specifically for Patrick's ending during the original broadcast were left behind, uncollected, and eventually became difficult to find anywhere at all. This kind of trimming is actually fairly common across television history in general, even outside of SpongeBob specifically. Live hosting segments, audience interaction moments, and special event framing material often get cut once a broadcast gets packaged for reruns or home video, since editors tend to treat that kind of material as filler, tied specifically to the original live moment, rather than as part of the core story worth preserving. What makes the You Wish case stand out is how much that specific trimming ended up mattering later, once fans started actively searching for a piece of television history that had quietly been left behind, simply because nobody at the time thought it needed the same level of careful preservation as the main story itself. This is an important distinction to understand clearly. The core alternate endings themselves, meaning the actual SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick story conclusions, are not what people consider lost. Those exist on physical DVD releases that collectors can still track down today. What became lost specifically were the connecting pieces, the live hosting segments featuring Patchy the Pirate reacting to and introducing each version, the parts that gave the entire event its game show feeling of build-up, suspense, and payoff. Without those wraparounds, watching the alternate endings today feels like watching only half of what the original 2001 broadcast actually offered its audience. It is the difference between watching a game show's final round with the host's commentary intact versus watching the exact same round with all of the host's lines edited out, leaving only the bare mechanics of what happened, without any of the build-up that made it exciting in the first place. For years, this left a gap in the historical record of an event that plenty of people who grew up watching the show in real time actually remembered clearly. Adults who were kids in 2001, sitting by their home phones waiting to see if their vote would count, remembered the excitement of it, remembered watching Patchy set up the stakes and celebrate whichever ending won. But finding an actual recording of those specific hosting segments proved to be extremely difficult for a long stretch of time, since Nickelodeon itself never seemed to re-release or rebroadcast that live framing material in its original English form after the initial airing had already happened. This left a strange gap between memory and available proof. Plenty of people could describe what they remembered watching, yet almost nobody could actually point to a copy of it existing anywhere for others to check against those memories. This kind of gap is exactly the situation that tends to attract the attention of dedicated media preservation communities, groups of people spread out across different countries who spend real time and effort trying to track down old broadcasts, recordings, and clips that companies themselves never bothered to properly archive. These communities usually work without any official support from the networks or studios involved, relying instead on personal recordings, old tapes bought secondhand, and long conversations comparing notes about what different people remember seeing on television years earlier. The You Wish wraparounds became exactly this kind of target, a specific, well-defined gap that people knew existed and actively wanted to fill, even without any guarantee that a surviving copy was out there to be found at all. The recovery of this lost material happened slowly and in an unusual order that says a lot lot about how lost pieces of television history actually get found in the modern internet age. The first real breakthrough came in September 2016 when a YouTube user going by the name Dark Lucario 3000 uploaded both wraparound segments to the platform. This was a genuinely exciting moment for anyone who had been searching for this footage, since it meant the actual patchy hosting material, previously thought to be completely gone, was still floating around somewhere and had finally resurfaced in a form people could actually watch. There was, however, a significant catch. The versions uploaded were not in English. They were dubbed in Spanish, meaning that whoever had originally recorded and preserved this footage had captured it from a broadcast airing in a Spanish-speaking country, rather than from the original American release. This meant that even after this upload, the original English-language version of these wraparound segments, the version that actually aired live on Nickelodeon back in 2001 for American audiences, remained missing. Fans finally had proof the segments existed and could be recovered in some form, but the specific version tied to the original broadcast that most English-speaking fans remembered watching live was still unavailable anywhere online. This half-win is worth sitting with, since it captures something true about how lost media recovery usually works in practice. Rarely does a search end with a single, perfect discovery that answers every remaining question at once. More often, recovery happens in layers, with each new discovery closing part of the gap while leaving another part still open. The 2016 upload proved the material had survived somewhere in the world, recorded off a broadcast in another country, preserved by someone who had no idea it would eventually matter to English-speaking fans searching for the exact same footage years later. That is often how these things survive at all. Not through careful, deliberate archiving by the original broadcaster, but through random, scattered personal recordings made in completely different countries for completely different reasons that happen to capture the same underlying content along the way. That gap stayed open for more than 6 additional years after the Spanish version surfaced. Then, in January 2023, another piece of the puzzle came together. A user on Twitter by the name Lamel Pizzo uploaded the English audio specifically for Squidward's wraparound segment. What makes this particular discovery interesting from a technical standpoint is exactly how this audio was recovered. Pizzo used something called the secondary audio programming option, a feature that some older television broadcasts include, specifically to carry an alternate language audio track alongside the main broadcast, most commonly used to provide a Spanish language option for English language television in the United States. By using this secondary audio feature, Pizzo was able to pull out and isolate the original English dialogue for this specific segment, giving fans their first real access to hearing this wraparound the way it actually sounded during its original 2001 broadcast. To understand why this method worked at all, it helps to know a little about how this kind of secondary audio feature functioned on older television sets and broadcasts. Many television broadcasts from this era were designed so that a viewer could switch their television to a secondary audio track, usually meant to provide an alternate language option for viewers who preferred it, without needing a completely separate broadcast or a completely separate recording device. This meant that a single physical recording of a broadcast, captured on an old tape, could actually contain more than one language track buried inside it, even if the person who originally recorded it only ever intended to capture the main, primary audio. Someone recording this broadcast years ago, with no special intention of preserving hidden material, may have unknowingly captured a full secondary audio track sitting alongside the main one, simply because that is how the broadcast signal was originally structured. This recovery method is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows something important about how lost television material sometimes survives in places nobody would think to check first. The original English broadcast recording of this segment, in a traditional sense, meaning a standard tape or direct copy of the show as it aired, does not appear to have survived or been shared publicly. But because broadcast television in this era sometimes carried a hidden secondary audio track built for accessibility or translation purposes, a copy of the correct English dialogue happened to still be embedded inside a broadcast recording that most people would have simply thought was just the Spanish dub. Someone with the right tools and the right patience was able to extract that hidden layer and share it with everyone else who had been searching for it. This detail matters beyond just this one specific case, since it points toward a broader lesson that applies across plenty of other lost media investigations as well. Sometimes, the assumption that a recording only contains what it appears to contain on the surface turns turns out to be wrong. A tape labeled simply as a Spanish dub might actually be hiding an untouched English audio track nobody thought to check for, sitting quietly inside the same physical recording the whole time. Finding lost material sometimes depends less on discovering a brand new recording nobody has ever seen, and more on someone taking a second, closer look at material that has technically been available all along, just never fully examined for everything it might actually contain. Even with this recovery, the picture remains incomplete. The find in January 2023 specifically covered Squidward's wraparound segment in English. This means that, depending on what has or has not surfaced since, Patrick's wraparound segment in its original English form may still be sitting in that same lost or hard-to-access category, potentially recoverable through a similar method if the right recording ever gets tracked down and examined the same way. The story of You Wish is not a case of everything being fully lost forever, nor is it a case of everything being fully found and settled. It sits in an unusual middle ground where some pieces have been recovered through pure luck and clever searching, while other pieces remain exactly where they were 20+ years ago, waiting for someone to stumble across the right old recording in the right format. There is something almost fitting about the way this particular piece of the show's history unfolded, given what the original event was actually about. You Wish was built entirely around giving the audience power over the story, letting viewers pick which version of the ending would become the official one through their own votes. Decades later, it has been the audience itself, working independently and without any help from Nickelodeon, who ended up piecing the surrounding material back together, one small discovery at a time. A YouTube upload in 2016 brought back the general shape of the wraparounds, even if the language was not quite right. A more technical, more patient piece of audio work in 2023 finally delivered a genuine English language recovery for at least one of the missing segments. Both of these recoveries came from individual fans working on their own initiative, years apart from each other, driven by nothing more than interest in preserving a piece of television history that the original broadcaster never seemed interested in properly re-releasing. It is worth pausing on just how much patience this kind of recovery actually requires. Neither of these two discoveries happened quickly. The first recovery took 15 years after the original broadcast to even surface in an incomplete, wrong language form. The second recovery took an additional 6.5 years beyond that to finally deliver even a partial English language version of just one of the two missing segments. This is not the kind of investigation that gets solved in a single afternoon of searching. It stretches across multiple people, multiple platforms, and multiple technical approaches, spread out over more than 2 decades, before even arriving at the current, still incomplete picture that exists today. This also raises a broader point about how much material from even a hugely successful, widely watched show can still slip through the cracks over time. SpongeBob SquarePants is not some obscure, forgotten program that only aired a handful of times to a small audience. It is one of the most successful cartoons ever made, watched by hundreds of millions of people across multiple decades, translated into dozens of languages, and merchandised into nearly every corner of daily life. And yet, a piece of its own broadcast history, a live special built specifically around audience participation, still has at least one confirmed gap in its recorded history that took over 2 decades to even partially close. Success and popularity do not automatically guarantee that every piece of a show's history gets carefully archived and preserved. Sometimes the connecting tissue between the parts everyone remembers, the small hosting segments and side pieces that gave an event its shape, are the exact things most likely to slip away first, simply because nobody at the time thought they needed special preservation beyond the original broadcast. The 3 actual story endings survived because DVD releases eventually carried them forward into a more permanent, purchasable format. The live hosting material, connecting those endings together, survived only through the far less reliable path of individual broadcast recordings, personal archives, and eventually the patience of internet users willing to dig through old tapes and hidden audio tracks years after the fact. That difference in how these 2 related pieces of the same event were treated says a lot about which parts of television productions tend to get formally preserved by studios, and which parts quietly depend on private collectors and dedicated fans to survive at all. A studio deciding what belongs belongs on an official home video release is essentially deciding, whether on purpose or not, which pieces of its own history get a real chance at long-term survival, and which pieces get left behind to rely purely on chance and the quiet dedication of whoever happened to be recording their television at the right moment on the right night. For now, the story of You Wish sits in a state of partial recovery. 2 patchy wraparound segments are confirmed to have existed. One has since been recovered in its correct original English form, thanks to a hidden secondary audio track and someone patient enough to go looking for it. The path forward for the remaining missing piece, if it exists somewhere in a similar hidden form, remains open, waiting for the next person willing to comb through old broadcast recordings in search of something most people never realized was still missing in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is another piece of the show's streaming history that did not require any digging or detective work to notice at all, since it happened suddenly, publicly, and left fans confused almost overnight. Section 4. The Midlife Crustacean Disappearance. Sometimes a piece of lost media does not disappear because a tape got thrown away, or because a recording from decades ago never got properly saved. Sometimes something goes missing right in front of everyone, in the modern era, on platforms that millions of people check every single day. That is exactly what happened with an episode called Midlife Crustacean, a story that involves no old broadcast tapes, no dusty archives, and no mystery about whether something was ever recorded in the first place. This is a case of an episode that plenty of people have already watched many times, simply vanishing from where it used to be. This kind of disappearance carries a different weight than the other stories covered so far in this video. Nobody has to wonder whether Midlife Crustacean actually exists, since millions of people already watched it multiple times over the better part of 2 decades before it quietly slipped away. There is no uncertainty about whether the recording survives somewhere, no need to comb through old broadcasts hoping a copy turns up, no dependence on a single crew member remembering the right detail at the right convention panel. The episode is fully real, fully finished, and fully known. What makes it worth examining here is the fact that something this well documented and this widely watched can still be pulled from view without any real explanation at all, simply because a company somewhere decided it should no longer sit on a specific platform. Midlife Crustacean is one of the show's more well-remembered episodes among longtime fans, especially those who grew up watching the earlier seasons. The plot centers on Mr. Krabs going through what the title plainly describes, a midlife crisis. Feeling old and feeling like his best years might be behind him, Mr. Krabs decides he wants to feel young again, and he pulls SpongeBob and Patrick into a night out on the town as part of that plan. This episode carries a sister episode alongside it, meaning the two were originally packaged and aired together as part of the same episode block, a common practice throughout much of the show's history, where 2 separate shorter stories get grouped into one full episode slot. This packaging habit matters more than it might initially seem, since it becomes the exact detail that turns this removal from a small, easily overlooked footnote into something fans could point to directly and demonstrate with real evidence. Episodes packaged together from the same original broadcast slot are usually treated as a single unit by streaming platforms, licensed together, uploaded together, and typically removed together if a platform's agreement to carry that content ever changes or expires. Under normal circumstances, if a licensing deal ends or a piece of content gets pulled for a routine business reason, both halves of a packaged pair would usually disappear together, since they were never meant to be split apart from each other in the first place. For years, Midlife Crustacean sat exactly where fans expected to find it, available through normal means just like any other episode from the earlier seasons. Then, without any formal announcement or explanation from the people who run the streaming platforms carrying the show, fans began to notice that the episode had quietly disappeared. It was gone specifically from Paramount Plus and from Amazon Prime Video, 2 of the major platforms where people commonly stream SpongeBob SquarePants content. What makes this removal especially noticeable, and what turned it from a small technical glitch into something fans actively started discussing and documenting, is that the episode's own sister episode, a story called The Great Snail Race, stayed completely untouched and fully available on those same platforms. If the entire episode block had vanished together, it might have looked like some kind of accidental licensing issue affecting a whole file. file. Instead, only half of the pairing disappeared, while its other half sat right where it always had been, streaming normally with no issues at all. This kind of selective removal, where one specific story gets pulled, while a paired story from the very same original broadcast stays in place, points toward a deliberate decision rather than any kind of accident or technical error. Streaming platforms do not typically split up officially packaged episode pairs by mistake. Someone made a choice to keep one story up while taking the other one down, and that choice has never been publicly explained by Nickelodeon, Paramount, or Amazon in any official statement that fans have been able to point to. It is worth pausing on how unusual this actually is within the wider world of streaming content management. Most viewers rarely think carefully about how episodes get uploaded, packaged, and licensed behind the scenes, since from the viewer's side, everything just appears to sit neatly in a library, organized by season and episode number, ready to watch whenever someone presses play. Behind that simple viewing experience sits a much messier reality involving contracts, licensing windows, content reviews, and internal decisions made by teams whose choices rarely reach public explanation unless something becomes noticeable enough for a large group of people to start asking questions all at once. Midlife Crustacean became exactly that kind of noticeable case, specifically because the missing half sat right next to its untouched twin, making the gap impossible to explain away as some kind of routine technical accident. Naturally, once fans noticed the gap, they went looking for the reason behind it. Since there was no official explanation offered, most of the conversation around this removal has centered on trying to figure out, based purely on the episode's own content, which specific scene or moment might have triggered a decision to quietly stop making it available. The scene that keeps coming up as the most likely explanation involves a specific plot point midway through the episode. As part of the night out that Patrick convinces Mr. Krabs to go along with, the two of them end up taking part in what gets described as a panty raid, sneaking into a house specifically to steal a pair of bloomers as some kind of prank or trophy from their wild night. The scene does not end well for either of them. They get caught in the act, and it turns out, in a twist clearly meant for comedic effect within the original episode, that the house they broke into belongs to none other than Mr. Krabs' own mother. She catches her grown son in the middle of this prank, gives him a stern scolding right there on the spot, and effectively grounds him like a misbehaving child, rather than the adult business owner he actually is throughout the rest of the series. Viewed simply as a joke within the flow of a normal SpongeBob episode, this scene fits comfortably within the kind of humor the show has used plenty of times across its run, leaning on slapstick embarrassment and a grown character getting treated like a scolded kid by an even older parent figure. But taken slightly more literally, stripped away from the cartoon exaggeration around it, the scene does involve two adult characters breaking into someone's home, specifically with the intention of stealing a piece of clothing linked to that person's undergarments. Framed that plainly, without the cartoon logic softening it, it becomes easier to understand why a company reviewing older children's content years later, under different standards than existed when the episode first aired, might view this particular scene as something no longer appropriate to keep easily available for a young audience without any warning attached. This kind of gap between how a joke plays inside a cartoon's own internal logic and how it reads when described plainly in ordinary words shows up across a lot of older animated comedy in general, not just in this one specific episode. A scene built purely around slapstick embarrassment and quick physical comedy can feel completely harmless while watching it unfold on screen, carried along by fast pacing, exaggerated reactions, and a general sense that nothing in this cartoon world carries real consequences the way it might in live action. The same basic sequence of events, written out plainly as a simple description of what two characters actually did, tends to lose that cushioning effect entirely, leaving behind just the bare plot points, without any of the tone that made the original scene feel light and silly rather than genuinely uncomfortable. This reasoning lines up with a broader pattern that has affected other pieces of older children's television as well, where content created under one set of cultural standards years ago sometimes gets quietly adjusted, edited, or pulled entirely once it gets reviewed again under a different, often stricter set of expectations. It is worth being clear that this explanation, while widely repeated and treated as the most likely reason among fans discussing the removal, remains an educated guess based on the episode's own content, rather than a confirmed statement from the companies involved. Nobody at Paramount, Paramount, Amazon, or Nickelodeon has released a public statement directly saying this specific scene is why the episode came down. The reasoning fans have settled on is built entirely from comparing what happens in the episode against what kind of content typically gets flagged or removed in similar situations elsewhere, not from any official confirmation tracing the removal back to that one scene specifically. What makes this particular removal frustrating for a large number of longtime fans is not just that an old favorite episode became harder to find. It is the specific contrast fans have pointed to involving another episode that remains fully available on the very same platforms where Midlife Crustacean disappeared. That other episode is called Are You Happy Now? And it has developed its own reputation among longtime viewers for containing a noticeably dark stretch of jokes centered on the idea of wanting to end one's own life, played for comedy within the context of the episode's plot. Fans raising concerns about the midlife crustacean removal have specifically pointed out that an episode built around this kind of dark joke has stayed completely untouched and easy to access, while an episode built around a comedic panty raid and a scolding from an old lady quietly disappeared instead. This specific comparison is what turns the whole situation from a minor content moderation footnote into something fans have organized around directly. If the goal behind removing midlife crustacean really was to protect younger viewers from content that no longer fits modern standards, the continued presence of an episode built around joking about wanting to die creates an obvious problem for that explanation. A panty raid played for slapstick embarrassment and a scene built around casual jokes involving a desire to end one's life sit very far apart from each other in terms of actual seriousness, yet only one of the two ended up disappearing from major streaming platforms. That mismatch is exactly what fans have latched onto, since it suggests that whatever standard was actually applied during this review process, it was not simply a matter of removing whatever content seemed most likely to genuinely concern parents watching alongside their kids. This contrast became a big part of why the removal frustrated so many longtime fans enough to organize an actual public response. A petition was created specifically asking for midlife crustacean to be brought back to streaming platforms. The petition lays out the argument in fairly direct terms, acknowledging that it is entirely possible Nickelodeon genuinely believed this specific moment in the episode was simply inappropriate for a young audience by today's standards, while also pointing out what the petition creators see as an inconsistency in how different kinds of potentially sensitive content get treated across the show's full library. The petition specifically notes that if older media is going to be reviewed and removed based on updated standards, it would make more sense for that kind of review to focus on content involving things widely recognized as genuinely harmful, such as material that reflects outdated and hurtful stereotypes, rather than a moment built around embarrassment and a scolding, especially when episodes containing darker material involving suicide-related jokes have stayed completely available without any adjustment or warning label attached. This argument reflects something fans across many long-running franchises have raised in similar situations elsewhere, where the specific content that ends up getting flagged and removed does not always match what audiences themselves would consider the most pressing concern if they were the ones making the decision. A petition like this represents an attempt by fans to make that mismatch visible and to put direct pressure on the companies involved to either explain their reasoning clearly or reconsider the specific choice that was made. The petition also raises a separate point worth including here, since it adds useful context about how this specific show continues to be marketed today. It notes that Nickelodeon's own official social media accounts, along with a wide range of official SpongeBob merchandise, regularly lean directly into nostalgia aimed at adult fans, frequently referencing memorable jokes and moments that longtime viewers, especially those who first watched the show as kids in its earliest seasons, still fondly remember and quote regularly. The petition argues that if a company is actively building marketing campaigns and merchandise lines around appealing to adult nostalgia for these earlier, edgier seasons of the show, quietly removing a well-remembered episode from that same era without any explanation feels inconsistent with how the brand otherwise treats and celebrates its own older material. This point about marketing consistency adds another layer to the overall frustration involved here. A brand actively selling nostalgia back to the adults who grew up with a show, while simultaneously and quietly removing pieces of that same nostalgic material from easy access, creates a strange contradiction contradiction that fans have not hesitated to point out directly. It suggests two different parts of the same company potentially working against each other. One side focused on marketing and merchandise, leaning hard into celebrating the show's older, edgier seasons, while another side focused on content review and platform management, quietly pulling pieces of that exact same era out of circulation, without connecting the two decisions in any visible way. It is worth being precise about exactly what is confirmed here and what remains fan interpretation, since this section is meant to stick closely to verified facts, rather than speculation dressed up as certainty. What is confirmed and documented clearly is this: Midlife Crustacean was removed from both Paramount Plus and Amazon Prime Video. Its sister episode, The Great Snail Race, remained available on those same platforms. Fans noticed this gap, discussed it publicly, and eventually created a formal petition specifically requesting the episode's return, directly referencing the panty raid scene as the likely cause, and directly contrasting it against the continued availability of Are You Happy Now and its suicide-related jokes. What remains unconfirmed, since no official statement has been issued explaining the decision, is the exact internal reasoning behind why this specific episode came down, while so many others featuring arguably more sensitive material have stayed exactly where they were. This gap between what fans can observe and what companies choose to explain publicly is actually a fairly common pattern across modern streaming platforms in general, extending well beyond just this one show. Streaming services regularly add and remove content from their libraries for all kinds of reasons, ranging from licensing agreements expiring to content reviews flagging specific material to simple internal decisions made by teams that rarely feel obligated to explain their choices directly to the public in detail. What makes the midlife crustacean situation stand out enough to earn its own section here is the unusually clean, easy to point to contrast involved. It is rare to have one specific episode disappear while its official sister episode, packaged and aired together from the very beginning, stays completely untouched right next to it. That specific detail turns this from a vague, hard-to-prove claim about inconsistent content moderation into something fans can point at directly and demonstrate with two episodes sitting side by side, one available and one missing. There is also something worth noting about how this kind of quiet content removal differs from the other lost media stories covered so far in this video. The earlier sections dealt with material that was either never fully released to the public in the first place, such as the original SpongeBob pilot audio, or material that existed briefly during a live broadcast and then became difficult to track down afterward, such as the You Wish wraparound segments. Midlife Crustacean represents a different kind of disappearance entirely. This is an episode that was fully released, widely watched, easily available for years across multiple platforms, and then deliberately pulled from at least two of those platforms during the modern streaming era, all while remaining perfectly accessible in other places, including on physical DVD releases that already existed before the removal took place. This means the episode itself is not lost in any meaningful sense, since plenty of ways to still watch it continue to exist for anyone determined enough to look. What has actually been lost is easy, casual access to it through the two major streaming platforms where most modern viewers would naturally expect to find any random episode of the show without needing to go searching through older physical media collections instead. This distinction matters because it points toward a newer, more modern category of lost or restricted media that older franchises are increasingly running into as their back catalogs get filtered through today's much more cautious approach to content aimed at children. A joke or scene that felt completely normal and unremarkable to broadcast in the early 2000s can end up looking very different when reviewed years later under a stricter, more careful lens, even when that same broader library still contains other jokes involving genuinely heavier subject matter that somehow avoided the same level of scrutiny. Midlife Crustacean sits as a clear, well-documented example of exactly this kind of modern content gap, confirmed through the episode's actual disappearance from named platforms, confirmed through the untouched sister episode sitting right next to the empty space it left behind, and confirmed through an organized fan response specifically built around pointing out the inconsistency between what got quietly removed and what stayed exactly where it always was. This raises a broader question worth sitting with about how large media libraries actually get maintained over time, especially for franchises that have been running long enough to include decades of material made under completely different cultural expectations than exist today. today. A single company rarely reviews an entire back catalog all at once, using one consistent standard applied evenly across every episode. More often, individual episodes or scenes get flagged one at a time, sometimes prompted by a viewer complaint, sometimes prompted by an internal review team working through older material, in whatever order happens to come up, and sometimes prompted by factors that never become public at all. This piecemeal approach can easily produce exactly the kind of inconsistency fans have pointed to here, where one episode disappears for a moment that reads as mildly risky when described plainly, while another episode containing far heavier subject matter simply never happens to get reviewed with the same scrutiny, purely due to the random order in which older content gets revisited, rather than any deliberate ranking of what actually deserves the closest look. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Removing an already finished, already aired episode from public platforms is one thing. An entirely different category of lost material involves episodes that never made it that far in the first place. Stories that were planned, written, and partly built only to be abandoned before they ever reached an audience at all. Section 5. SpongeBob Invader Pants and Krabs Army, The Scrapped. Season 9 episodes. Every long-running show ends up with a graveyard of ideas that never made it to air, scripts and outlines that got written, planned, and then quietly shelved before cameras or animation crews ever finished the job. Most of these abandoned ideas leave behind almost nothing, maybe a mention in an old interview or a single line in a production document somewhere. But every so often, a scrapped episode leaves behind just enough evidence, coming directly from the people who worked on it, that fans can piece together a fairly clear picture of what almost happened. That is exactly the case with two connected episodes planned for Season 9 of SpongeBob SquarePants, known by the working titles SpongeBob Invader Pants and Krabs Army. Season 9 of the show, which aired episodes across the mid-2010s, went through what a lot of long-running productions go through at some point, meaning not every planned episode from that stretch of production actually made it to a finished, broadcast-ready state. Around 2015, these two particular episodes were far enough along in development to have a real shape and a real plot, yet they never crossed the finish line into becoming something audiences could actually watch. Instead, they were canceled partway through the process, joining a list of ideas that started strong and then stopped. What makes this specific pair of episodes worth its own section, rather than just a passing mention alongside dozens of other scrapped ideas across the show's 25-plus year history, is how much confirmed evidence exists connecting directly back to the people who actually worked on them. This is not a case built entirely on rumor or fan guesswork. Storyboard artists and the show's own technical director have spoken about these episodes directly, in their own words, giving fans real material to work from, instead of just secondhand claims passed around online with no clear source behind them. The clearest piece of surviving evidence traces back to a storyboard artist named Casey Alexander, who worked on the show during this period. According to information that's circulated on the show's main fan wiki, storyboards for at least one of these two canceled episodes did genuinely exist at some point. Storyboards, for anyone unfamiliar with how cartoons get made, are the rough visual drawings that map out how a story will unfold, scene by scene, before any actual full animation work begins. Having storyboards means an episode moved well past just being a written outline sitting in a drawer. It means artists had already begun turning the story into a sequence of drawn scenes, the exact stage of production that comes right before an episode would move toward becoming a fully finished, broadcast-ready piece of television. For a while, though, even this piece of evidence sat on shaky ground. The information about these storyboards had been shared through a link pointing to Casey Alexander's own Facebook page, where he had apparently posted images related to the canceled episode himself. But links on the internet do not last forever, and by around 2019, that original link had gone dead, meaning anyone trying to verify the claim by clicking through to see the storyboards for themselves would have hit a dead end instead. This left the story sitting in an odd, frustrating space for a few years, where the general claim of storyboards existing was known and repeated by fans, yet the actual visual proof behind that claim had become difficult to access directly. That changed on January 30th, 2019, when a user active on a website dedicated to tracking down lost media, using the username TheSpongyOne, uploaded a set of images specifically described as storyboards for SpongeBob Invader Pants. According to this user's own account of how they obtained these images. They had personally found and saved a photo of the storyboards that had originally been posted to Casey Alexander's Facebook page, keeping a copy of it even after the original post itself became inaccessible through the dead link. The user acknowledged that the quality of the saved image was not perfect, describing it as somewhat low quality, but confirmed they still had it saved and were willing to share it publicly for other fans interested in seeing it. This kind of recovery pattern shows up again and again throughout the story of lost media connected to long-running shows. Something gets posted briefly by someone directly involved in making the show, often in a casual, informal way through personal social media rather than any official announcement. That original post disappears over time, whether through an account being deleted, a platform shutting down, or simply a link breaking due to changes on the website hosting it. But if even one person happens to save a copy before that original post vanishes, the material can still survive and eventually resurface through a completely different channel years later. That is essentially what happened here, with a personal Facebook post from a storyboard artist becoming, through pure chance and one attentive fan's decision to save a copy, the surviving visual proof that this canceled episode had actually reached the storyboard stage of production. Alongside this visual evidence, additional confirmation came directly from Vincent Waller, who has served as the show's technical director since 2005 and has remained closely involved with its creative direction for a long stretch of the show's history. Waller has a habit of engaging directly with fans through social media, often answering questions about production history, confirming or denying rumors, and occasionally sharing small details about episodes that never made it to air. In the case of these two scrapped episodes, Waller addressed them directly on Twitter on more than one occasion. In one of these posts, Waller talked specifically about the reasons behind why these episodes ended up getting scrapped in the first place. This detail matters quite a bit, since a lot of canceled media across all kinds of shows and movies never comes with any real explanation attached, leaving fans to guess endlessly about why something got shelved without ever getting a straight answer from anyone actually involved. Having the show's own technical director speak directly about the reasoning behind a cancellation gives this particular case a level of clarity that most abandoned episodes across television history simply do not have. Waller also addressed a separate rumor that had built up around whether Crab's Army specifically ever existed as a real planned episode at all, since some fans had started to doubt whether this second title represented an actual project or whether it might have been confused with something else entirely, or possibly never been real in the first place. Waller's tweets on this subject worked to clarify exactly what was real and what was not, effectively confirming the plot and existence of SpongeBob Invader Pants directly, while separately addressing the more uncertain status surrounding Crab's Army as a connected but distinct piece of the same scrapped production effort. One additional detail that adds a small but genuine layer of intrigue to this story involves a much later, fully aired episode from season 12 called Farmer Bob. Within that episode's climax, a group of hillbilly-styled aliens arrive at a character's farm and take part in a barn dance sequence. Fans who remembered the earlier scrapped SpongeBob Invader Pants concept noticed a possible connection here, since it is entirely possible that the alien character designs originally created for the canceled season 9 episode ended up getting reused in some adapted form for this later episode instead. This kind of reuse is actually a fairly normal and practical habit in ongoing television production. Character designs, background art, and even entire concepts that get shelved for one specific episode do not necessarily go to waste completely, since animation studios often recycle earlier design work into future episodes, rather than throwing away completed creative material just because its original intended use fell through. Still, it is worth being precise about what this connection actually represents. There is no direct, confirmed statement tying the Farmer Bob alien designs specifically back to the canceled SpongeBob Invader Pants concept. This remains an educated observation based on visual similarity and general industry practice, not a confirmed fact backed by a direct statement from Waller or anyone else involved in either episode. Beyond the confirmed storyboards and Waller's direct social media statements, very little additional material connected to these two episodes has ever surfaced publicly. As of assessments made around 2019, several years after the original cancellation, fans tracking this particular piece of lost media noted that essentially nothing new had come to light since the initial wave of information appeared. The consensus among those those following the story closely was that, barring some unexpected change of direction where the production team decided to revisit these old scrapped ideas and actually finish them, these particular episodes were likely to remain permanently unfinished and unreleased, existing only as storyboards, a handful of social media posts, and whatever memories the small number of people directly involved in their early development still carry with them. This raises a broader point worth sitting with about how television production actually works behind the scenes, a reality that casual viewers rarely get much insight into. Long-running animated shows do not simply produce every single episode idea that gets pitched or outlined during the writing process. Multiple ideas typically move forward at once during any given production season, with writers and storyboard artists developing several concepts simultaneously before decisions get made about which ones will actually continue toward becoming finished episodes, and which ones will get set aside for various reasons, whether creative, scheduling related, or something else entirely. Most viewers watching the final broadcast episodes each week have no idea how many other stories were being developed alongside the ones that eventually made it to their television screens. SpongeBob, Invader Pants, and Krabs Army represent two specific documented examples of exactly this kind of behind-the-scenes reality, cases where the development process moved forward far enough to produce real, tangible material, storyboards drawn by an actual credited artist, before the decision was made to stop and redirect that creative effort elsewhere. It is also worth noting how this particular case differs from some of the other lost or scrapped material connected to the show's broader history. Some canceled ideas exist only as a title and a vague description, with no visual material or direct crew commentary ever surfacing to confirm much of anything concrete about them. Other canceled ideas might exist purely as rumors passed around by fans, with no real connection to anyone who actually worked on the show at all. SpongeBob Invader Pants sits in a stronger, more well-documented category than either of those situations. There are actual storyboard images, however low in quality the surviving copy might be, tracing back to a credited artist who worked on the show during that era. There are direct statements from the show's own technical director addressing both the plot details and the reasoning behind the cancellation. This combination of visual evidence and direct crew commentary places this particular piece of scrapped content on considerably firmer, factual ground than most rumors circulating about unfinished cartoon episodes typically manage to reach. The uncertainty that remains here is narrower and more specific than a lot of other lost media cases covered so far. Nobody is arguing about whether these episodes existed in some planned form, since Waller himself has confirmed that much directly. The open questions instead center on smaller details, such as exactly how far production advanced beyond the storyboard stage that has already surfaced, whether any other visual material beyond what the spongy one managed to save and share still exists somewhere in an old hard drive or a forgotten folder belonging to someone who worked on the episode, and whether the alien designs later seen in Farmer Bob actually represent a direct reuse of this earlier scrapped work, or simply a separate, unrelated design choice that happened to look somewhat similar by coincidence. This case also demonstrates something worth remembering about how modern lost media investigations actually succeed when they do manage to recover something meaningful. It rarely comes down to a single dramatic discovery. Instead, it tends to build slowly, piece by piece, often relying on one person saving a copy of something before it disappears, another person asking the right direct question to someone who actually worked on the project, and enough time passing for these separate, small pieces of evidence to eventually connect into a fuller picture. A storyboard artist's personal social media post, a technical director's willingness to answer fan questions directly online, a dedicated fan on a lost media-focused website who happened to have saved a copy of an image before its original source vanished. None of these pieces alone would have been enough to properly document this canceled pair of episodes. Together, they form a reasonably clear, well-sourced account of two stories that came close to reaching television screens and then stopped just short of getting there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is a meaningful difference between an episode getting canceled before it starts and an episode that gets fully finished, fully broadcast, and then deliberately buried by the very people who once celebrated it. Section 6. The Scrapped. 200th episode special. Milestone episodes carry a specific kind of pressure that ordinary episodes never have to deal with. A A regular episode just needs to be funny, land its jokes, and fit into the rest of the season around it. A milestone episode, something built specifically to mark a big round number, like an anniversary or a numbered achievement, carries the extra weight of being remembered as an event. SpongeBob SquarePants ran into exactly this kind of pressure while approaching its 200th episode, and the story of what was originally planned for that milestone and what actually happened instead is one of the clearer documented cases of a finished creative plan getting abandoned midstream because of outside circumstances. The basic plot of the originally planned 200th episode special centers on a fairly simple but emotionally loaded idea. SpongeBob and Patrick, who are established throughout the entire series as inseparable best friends, learn something that shakes the foundation of their friendship. The premise states plainly that sponges and sea stars are not supposed to be normal friends in the first place, and once that idea takes hold, it tears their friendship apart, and the fallout does not stay contained just between the two of them. It spreads outward, eventually pulling in the entire town of Bikini Bottom as well. This premise stands out immediately for anyone familiar with the show's usual formula. SpongeBob and Patrick's friendship functions as one of the most stable, dependable relationships across the entire series, rarely questioned or threatened in any serious way across hundreds of regular episodes. Building an entire milestone special around actually breaking that friendship apart, even temporarily, represents a much bigger emotional swing than the show typically takes. This alone suggests the creative team wanted this particular episode to feel like a genuine event, something that justified its special status by doing something the regular episode format usually avoids. The episode was planned to fill 2 production slots, meaning it was built as a longer piece divided across 2 segments rather than a single short story, matching the 29th and 30th segments planned for season 9 at the time. Beyond simply being a longer format episode, this special carried an even bigger job to do. It was originally meant to be packaged and advertised specifically as the show's 200th episode milestone, a marketing angle built to draw attention to the achievement of the show reaching that specific numbered point in its run. Production moved forward far enough that a promotional image connected to this episode eventually leaked out into public view, though not right away. This image did not surface until December 2022, appearing on the messaging platform Discord, years after the special itself had already been quietly shelved and replaced with something else entirely. The gap between whenever this promotional material was originally created and when it actually became publicly visible highlights something true about a lot of unreleased media connected to major franchises. Material tied to abandoned projects does not necessarily disappear the moment a project gets canceled. It can sit privately, sometimes for years, before eventually finding its way into public circulation through channels the original studio never intended or controlled. The reason this milestone special ended up getting scrapped traces directly back to timing and a much bigger project happening at the same time. Around the period this special was being developed, the franchise was also deep into producing its second feature film, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water. Full-length movies require an enormous amount of resources, time, and creative attention from the same pool of people responsible for producing the regular television series. And when a studio is pouring significant effort into a theatrical release, television production sometimes has to shift, adjust, or in this case, abandon planned projects to accommodate the bigger priority. The 200th episode special was scrapped specifically following production of that movie, meaning the movie's production needs effectively overtook and displaced this planned milestone special before it could be finished and aired. Once the original special was abandoned, the milestone itself did not simply disappear from the schedule altogether. The show still needed something to mark the 200th episode occasion, since that kind of round number achievement tends to get noted publicly, regardless of what specific creative plan falls through behind the scenes. In place of the friendship breakup storyline, the milestone slot was eventually filled instead by an episode called Goodbye Krabby Patty. This replacement episode went on to actually air and become the official version of the show's 200th episode milestone that audiences saw and that continues to exist in the show's official broadcast history today. This substitution says something interesting about how television production sometimes handles big, symbolic dates under pressure. A round number milestone like an anniversary episode or a numbered episode count often gets locked into a schedule well ahead of time, sometimes tied to specific marketing plans, press coverage, or promotional campaigns built around that exact date or episode number. When the original creative plan for that milestone falls through partway into production, the studio still faces the reality that the calendar date or episode count itself is not going to wait around for a replacement idea to get fully developed from scratch. This often means an existing episode, one that may have been in development anyway as part of the regular season lineup, gets repositioned and reassigned to fill that milestone slot instead, allowing the show to still mark its intended achievement on schedule, even though the specific creative concept originally built for that moment ends up shelved indefinitely. What makes this case particularly interesting from a lost media perspective is the existence of that leaked promotional image from December 2022. Promotional material for a project usually only gets created once a production has moved forward far enough to be confident the project will actually reach completion and release. Studios do not typically invest time and resources building promotional artwork for ideas still sitting purely at the earliest concept or pitch stage, since that would represent wasted effort on something that might never move forward at all. The fact that promotional material existed for this specific episode suggests the special had progressed well past a bare-bones concept, moving into a stage where the studio believed it was worth investing in materials meant to build anticipation and market the episode ahead of its planned release. This detail shifts how this canceled special should be understood compared to some of the earlier scrapped material covered in this video. Some canceled episodes exist only as early written outlines or pitch documents, ideas that never advanced far enough to require any kind of promotional investment at all. This particular 200th episode special appears to have moved considerably further along than that, reaching a stage where the studio was actively preparing to promote it as a real upcoming milestone event, before the movie's production needs forced a change in direction and pulled the plan off the table entirely. The specific content of the promotional image itself, based on available information, connects directly to the friendship breakup premise described in the original outline, giving fans visual confirmation that ties the leaked artwork to this exact canceled storyline, rather than leaving room for confusion about whether the image might belong to some other unrelated project entirely. This kind of direct visual confirmation strengthens the overall case considerably, moving this from a story built purely on secondhand plot descriptions into something supported by an actual surviving piece of promotional material that fans have been able to see and examine for themselves. There is also something worth considering about why this particular storyline, focused on breaking apart the friendship between SpongeBob and Patrick, might have been considered strong enough to anchor a milestone episode in the first place. Milestone episodes across many long-running shows often try to do something the regular episode format typically avoids, whether that means addressing a character's backstory in unusual depth, bringing back elements from much earlier in the show's run, or, in this case, directly threatening a relationship the show has spent years establishing as rock solid and dependable. Choosing to build a milestone episode around genuinely testing the SpongeBob and Patrick friendship suggests the creative team wanted this particular special to carry real emotional stakes, something that would feel meaningfully different from a typical episode precisely because it dared to threaten something the show almost never puts at risk. The eventual replacement, Goodbye Krabby Patty, took the milestone slot in a completely different creative direction, focusing instead on the Krusty Krab's signature food item, rather than on any kind of emotional threat to the core friendship between the show's two lead characters. This means the milestone occasion that audiences actually got to see ended up looking nothing like what had originally been planned for that same numbered spot in the show's history. Anyone watching Goodbye Krabby Patty as it aired would have had no way of knowing that a completely different story, one built around breaking apart SpongeBob and Patrick's friendship and eventually pulling the whole town into the fallout, had originally been intended to fill that exact milestone slot instead. This case also highlights an important distinction worth remembering when discussing scrapped or canceled media across any large franchise. Not every abandoned idea gets canceled because the concept itself was considered weak, poorly written, or unworkable creatively. Sometimes a genuinely promising, far enough along concept gets shelved purely because of competing priorities elsewhere in the production pipeline, timing conflicts with other bigger projects demanding the same resources and creative attention, or scheduling pressures that have nothing to do with the actual quality of the abandoned idea itself. Based on how far this particular special appears to have progressed, reaching reaching the promotional material stage before getting pulled. This looks much more like a case of competing priorities and a movie taking precedence, rather than a case of the creative team deciding the friendship breakup storyline itself was not good enough to use. It is worth being precise about what remains confirmed here versus what stays somewhat uncertain, since maintaining that kind of clarity matters throughout every section of this kind of investigation. What is confirmed includes the basic premise of the canceled special, the 2-segment production slots it was assigned within Season 9, its original intended role as the show's official 200th episode milestone marketing angle, the specific reason for its cancellation, tracing back to the competing production schedule of the second SpongeBob movie, the replacement episode that ultimately filled its intended milestone slot, and the eventual public leak of promotional material connected to the canceled special in December 2022. What remains less certain includes finer details about exactly how far the actual animation or voice recording process advanced before the project was shelved, and whether any additional unreleased material beyond the single leaked promotional image still exists somewhere in private hands, waiting for a similar public leak the way this one eventually happened, years after the fact. This pattern, where promotional or production material connected to a canceled project quietly resurfaces years after the fact through channels the original studio never controlled, connects to a recurring theme running through several of the cases covered across this entire video. Material tied to abandoned television projects rarely disappears completely and permanently the moment a cancellation decision gets made internally. It often continues existing somewhere, sitting quietly in private files, personal archives, or old hard drives belonging to people who worked on the project, until eventually, sometimes years later, a small piece finds its way into public circulation, whether through a leak, an old social media post resurfacing, or someone finally deciding to share material they had been holding on to privately for a long stretch of time. The 200th episode special stands as a clear example of a project that reached a real, substantial stage of development, complete with a specific plot, an assigned production slot, and enough investment to justify creating promotional material, only to be pulled at the last moment because of an entirely separate, much bigger project competing for the same resources and attention. Unlike some other scrapped material covered earlier in this video, this case does not leave much room for debate about whether the project genuinely existed in a serious, advanced form. The combination of a detailed plot description, confirmed production slot assignments, a clearly stated reason for cancellation, and an actual leaked promotional image gives this particular piece of lost media a stronger factual foundation than most canceled episode stories typically manage to reach. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every piece of history covered in this video involves something that was actually made and then lost or replaced. Some of the strangest stories involve something that never happened at all, yet somehow convinced an entire generation of fans that it did. Section 7. The Reef Blower Theory. A rumor officially debunked. Reef Blower stands out as one of the strangest entries in the entire history of SpongeBob SquarePants, simply because it is the only episode in the whole series with no spoken dialogue at all. It aired as the second segment of the very first broadcast, right after the pilot episode Help Wanted, on May 1st, 1999, following that year's Kids' Choice Awards. For over 2 decades, fans have repeated a specific explanation for why this particular episode has no talking in it at all. That explanation turned out to be false, and the real reason behind the silence took over 20 years to become public knowledge. The plot of Reef Blower is simple. Squidward finds a small shell sitting on his lawn and kicks it over onto SpongeBob's side instead of dealing with it himself. SpongeBob notices the shell and decides to clean it up using a reef blower, which works like an underwater version of a leaf blower. Things go wrong quickly. The shell turns into a cloud of sand that lands all over Squidward. SpongeBob tries to fix the mess, which only makes Squidward more irritated. Eventually, the reef blower sucks up a pile of sand, jams, and starts malfunctioning. SpongeBob keeps trying to force it to work, and when it finally does start again, it sucks up all of the ocean water surrounding them. Squidward, unable to breathe air the way a land creature could, begins to suffocate until the machine explodes and releases all the water again. Through this entire sequence, involving a fair amount of physical chaos and something close to Squidward almost dying, nobody speaks a single line out loud from start to finish. For a long time, the accepted explanation among fans for why this specific episode episode had no dialogue was tied to a story about broken equipment. According to this widely repeated version of events, Reef Blower was originally supposed to have spoken dialogue, just like every other episode of the show. The story claimed that the recording studio's audio equipment broke down at the time, and because there was no way to fix it or find another way to record dialogue before the episode needed to be finished, the crew was forced to rewrite the episode to work entirely without spoken lines. This version of the story became so widely accepted that it even appeared for years as an official piece of trivia listed on IMDb, a major film and television information website that many casual fans treat as a reliable source without questioning where the information originally came from. This explanation spread everywhere. It showed up on fact-listing websites unrelated to any dedicated SpongeBob fan community. It appeared on multiple SpongeBob wiki pages as accepted trivia. It got repeated in casual conversations and online lists about interesting facts related to the show for well over 20 years, largely unquestioned, since it offered a simple, easy-to-understand reason for something that otherwise looked unusual, an entire cartoon episode with no talking at all. The actual truth came from someone who had no reason to keep quiet about it, and every reason to know exactly what really happened. Jay Lender worked as a storyboard artist on the original pilot episode, meaning he was there during the actual production of this specific segment of the show, not someone speaking secondhand based on rumors passed down from other people. On June 10th, 2022, after a fan asked him directly on Twitter whether the broken equipment story was true, Lender addressed the question head-on and gave the real explanation. According to Lender, the actual reason Reef Blower has no dialogue has nothing to do with broken equipment at all. It comes down to something far more practical, related to how the pilot episode was structured and how television production budgets actually work. The very first episode, Help Wanted, ran about 8 minutes long on its own. Nickelodeon needed a full 11-minute segment to properly fill out that time slot as a complete half show. Reef Blower was created specifically to stretch Help Wanted out to that required full length, functioning essentially as an extension rather than as a fully separate standalone story with its own complete creative vision from the start. Because Help Wanted and Reef Blower were technically produced as separate pieces rather than as one single continuous episode, a rule tied to the Actors Union, the Screen Actors Guild, came into play. Under that rule, if voice actors were going to record dialogue for Reef Blower as its own separate production, the studio would have needed to pay them an entirely new set of session fees, treating it as if it were a completely separate recording job, rather than simply continuing work already being paid for through Help Wanted. Based on Lender's account, this additional cost would have come out to around $2,500 at the time, an amount worth close to $4,700 in today's money. Given that Reef Blower was already a very short piece of content, built purely to pad out the runtime of the actual pilot episode, the production team decided it made more financial sense to simply skip recording new dialogue for it entirely, rather than pay an entire additional session fee for voice actors just to fill out a few extra minutes of screen time. Instead of treating the absence of dialogue as a problem needing to be fixed, the crew leaned into it, building the segment specifically around visual comedy and physical slapstick instead of spoken jokes, which the Reef Blower storyline was already well suited to carry on its own. Lender's explanation is backed up by more than just his own memory of events from over 2 decades earlier. Model sheets connected to this episode, meaning reference materials used during production to keep character designs and details consistent throughout the animation process, actually list an early working title for this segment. That working title was Pilot Extension, a name that directly reflects its real purpose as an add-on piece meant to stretch out the runtime of the actual pilot, rather than existing as its own fully separate creative concept from the very beginning. A title like that would make very little sense if the episode had genuinely been intended from the start as a normal, standalone story that just happened to lose its dialogue due to a technical failure partway through production. There is another detail worth including here that adds further weight to Lender's explanation. Storyboards, the rough drawings used to plan out how a scene will unfold before full animation begins, typically do include notes about dialogue when an episode is meant to have spoken lines, since storyboard artists need to know where dialogue fits alongside the visual action they are drawing. The surviving storyboards for Reef Blower show no references references to any spoken dialogue anywhere in them, which supports the idea that the segment was designed from the very beginning to be dialogue-free, rather than having its dialogue stripped out later due to some kind of unexpected equipment failure partway through the process. The broken equipment story also runs into a much simpler logical problem once it gets examined closely. The explanation implies that once the recording equipment failed, there was no way at all to record any dialogue anywhere else, as if Hollywood in 1999 only had access to one single recording booth in the entire city. In reality, professional voice recording studios were common throughout the Los Angeles area at that time, meaning a genuine equipment failure at one specific studio would not have permanently prevented a production from recording dialogue somewhere else nearby, if the actual creative plan had truly required spoken lines for this segment. Once Lender's tweets became public, they effectively closed the book on a rumor that had circulated for well over 20 years, treated by a huge number of casual fans as simple, harmless trivia about the show's earliest history. This case stands out from most other pieces of lost or misunderstood media covered so far in this video, because instead of confirming something that people suspected was true, or recovering a piece of media that had gone missing over time, this particular story involves correcting a piece of accepted, repeated misinformation using a direct, first-hand account from someone who was actually there during the original production. It is worth pointing out that this same equipment failure explanation actually appears elsewhere too, and Reef Blower is not the only piece of SpongeBob folklore built around a similar kind of broken technology story. Similar claims about equipment failures or damaged recordings have circulated around other specific scenes and moments throughout the show's history, often used as a catch-all explanation whenever fans notice something unusual or unexplained about how a particular episode was put together. The Reef Blower case stands apart from most of these other similar rumors, specifically because it received such a clear, detailed, and directly sourced correction, coming straight from someone who had worked on the actual production, rather than relying on guesswork, assumption, or unverified claims passed down secondhand through years of repetition. This case also connects to a small piece of trivia within the episode itself that occasionally still confuses newer viewers encountering it for the first time. At one specific moment, SpongeBob appears to say the word "you," with the word appearing as an on-screen subtitle for the audience to read. Despite the subtitle appearing clearly on screen, there is no actual audio for this line at all. This single subtitled word remains true to the episode's overall dialogue-free design, since even this small moment never actually gets voiced out loud in the original English version. Interestingly, several international versions of the show, dubbed in other languages, including Latin American Spanish, French, Dutch, and several others, do include an actual spoken version of this one line, even though the original English broadcast never gave it an audible voice at all. Taken as a whole, the real story behind Reef Blower's silence turns out to be far less dramatic than the popular rumor suggested, but arguably more interesting precisely because it reveals something genuine about how early television production actually worked behind the scenes. A short, dialogue-free cartoon segment did not happen because something broke unexpectedly during recording. It happened because of a very specific, very practical decision involving runtime requirements, union payment rules, and a production team choosing to lean into visual comedy rather than spend extra money on dialogue for a segment that was only ever meant to stretch out a longer episode to the length a network needed it to be. This case shows how a piece of accepted trivia can circulate as fact for over 2 decades, repeated across websites, fan communities, and even official reference sources like IMDb, without anyone directly connected to the actual production stepping in to correct it, simply because nobody happened to ask the right person the right question until 2022 finally brought a clear answer directly from someone who was actually there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every piece of confusion surrounding an early SpongeBob episode has been settled quite this cleanly, and one particular uncensored recording connected to a much later, much more controversial episode remains only partly confirmed, sitting somewhere between rumor and reality even today. Section 8. The Uncensored Sailor Mouth Tape. Sailor Mouth first aired on Nickelodeon on September 21st, 2001, as part of the second season of SpongeBob SquarePants. On the surface, it looks like a simple, funny episode built around a familiar childhood childhood situation. SpongeBob and Patrick find a bad word written on a dumpster behind the Krusty Krab, and without understanding what the word actually means, they start using it constantly, getting themselves into trouble everywhere they go. What most fans do not immediately think about is that behind this finished, family-friendly episode sits a completely different recording, one that has never been officially released to the public, and one that at least one member of the show's own crew has confirmed he personally owned on tape before eventually losing track of it. The idea for this episode did not come out of nowhere. It grew directly out of real childhood memories belonging to the show's own creative team. Derek Dryman, who worked as creative director on the show, has spoken about how the story was inspired by something that actually happened to him as a kid, specifically a time he got in trouble for saying a curse word in front of his own mother. Several small details from that real memory made their way directly into the finished episode. The scene where Patrick runs to tattle to Mr. Krabs while SpongeBob chases after him reflects how Dryman remembers his own situation playing out in real life. Even the ending of the episode, where Mr. Krabs ends up swearing worse than SpongeBob and Patrick combined, traces back to a real detail from Dryman's own life, since, according to him, his own mother had a habit of using rough language herself. Since this episode was always going to center on characters using curse words, even in a cartoon aimed mainly at children, the creative team had to figure out exactly how to handle that content in a way that would actually be allowed to air. Instead of using a normal censoring method, like a simple beep sound covering up each word, the way many shows handle bad language, the team made an unusual choice. Every time a character swears in the finished episode, the word gets replaced with a dolphin-like chirping sound instead. This decision was shaped directly by concerns about whether the episode would even be considered appropriate for the show's young audience in the first place, and using a strange, almost silly sound instead of a typical censor beep helped keep the tone light and comedic, rather than making the swearing feel like something serious or forbidden. Steven Hillenburg himself has spoken about where the basic concept for this episode came from. According to his own recollection from 2016, he was the one who originally pitched the idea that SpongeBob and Patrick would learn a curse word and not fully understand what it meant, which became the entire foundation the rest of the episode was built around. Here is where the story moves from simple behind-the-scenes trivia into something that connects directly to the idea of lost, unreleased material. Tom Kenny, who has voiced SpongeBob since the very beginning of the show, revealed something surprising during a panel appearance at a convention called Kineticon back in 2016. According to Kenny, when it came time to actually record the dialogue for this episode, the original script did not simply tell the actors to say real curse words outright. Instead, the script apparently included an instruction telling the actors to ad-lib something close to swearing without actually using real curse words, meaning the actors were supposed to improvise fake-sounding bad language on the spot without crossing into anything genuinely explicit. According to Kenny, this instruction turned out to be far harder to actually perform than anyone expected. Making up fake-sounding curse words on the spot while still making a scene feel funny and natural proved to be a real challenge for the cast during recording. Because of how difficult this was turning out to be, the actors ended up asking whether they could simply say real curse words during the actual recording session, with the understanding that the studio would go back afterward and cover those words up using the dolphin sound effect during editing, rather than trying to force a fake, watered-down version of swearing to sound convincing in the moment. Kenny has stated that Steven Hillenburg was the one who ultimately gave permission for the actors to go ahead and record using real curse words during that session. Hillenburg's reasoning made sense from a practical standpoint, since the final version of the episode was always going to be censored using the dolphin sound, regardless of what words were actually said during recording. If the audience would never actually hear the real words either way, allowing the actors to say them clearly during the session, purely to make the performance feel more natural and easier to act out convincingly, would not actually change anything about what ended up in the version that would eventually air on television. This means that somewhere, sitting in a studio recording from around 2001, a version of this episode exists where SpongeBob, Patrick, Mr. Krabs, and other characters are heard using actual, real-world curse words, fully audible and completely uncensored, rather than having those words covered up by the dolphin sound that appears in the broadcast version everyone has actually seen. Kenny has described this specific recording session as one of the hardest episodes episodes he ever worked on, specifically because of how funny it was to perform. According to him, hearing characters like Patrick, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs actually cursing out loud during the session was hilarious in a way that almost made it difficult to get through the recording without breaking character from laughing. Kenny did not stop at simply describing the experience. During that same 2016 appearance, he stated plainly that this uncensored version was something the public would never be allowed to hear. He even joked that Nickelodeon likely had these original recordings buried somewhere extremely deep and inaccessible, treating it almost like a piece of forbidden material the network would never willingly release into public circulation. For years after Kenny's comments became public, this uncensored recording existed mainly as something fans knew about secondhand, based entirely on one interview, without any additional confirmation from anyone else connected to the show. That changed in 2021, when Roger Bumpus, the actor who has voiced Squidward since the beginning of the series, addressed the same topic directly during a panel appearance at LA Comic-Con. Bumpus confirmed the existence of this uncensored version as well, adding a second voice directly from inside the production to back up what Kenny had already revealed years earlier. Having two separate members of the main voice cast confirm the same recording independently at two different public events years apart moves this well past the level of a vague rumor and into something with real, direct confirmation from the people who were actually there. The story took its most significant turn more recently when Paul Tibbitt, who worked as a writer and producer on the show and also personally voiced the character of Mama Krabs within this very episode, addressed the topic during a question and answer session held through the Art of SpongeBob Discord server. During this session, Tibbitt revealed that he personally once owned an actual VHS tape containing the uncensored version of this episode. This detail is significant because it moves the story from simply confirming that an uncensored recording exists somewhere in general to confirming that a specific physical copy of it on a tape format widely used for home recording and playback at the time was once in the direct possession of someone who worked closely on the episode itself. Unfortunately, Tibbitt also revealed that he is no longer sure exactly where that VHS tape currently is. This means that even though a real, physical copy of the uncensored recording is confirmed to have existed and to have been held privately by someone directly connected to the show, its current location remains unknown, even to the very person who once had it in his own possession. This puts the uncensored Sailor Mouth recording in an unusual category. It is not a rumor invented purely by fans with no basis in reality. It is a confirmed recording, described independently by three separate people who worked directly on the show, including one who personally owned a physical copy of it. Yet despite all of that direct confirmation, no verified copy of the actual audio has ever been shared publicly or found its way into circulation online. This gap between confirmed existence and continued unavailability created exactly the kind of environment where a fake version was bound to eventually show up. And that is exactly what happened in November 2023. A voice clip was posted on a Discord server connected to the Lost Media Wiki community, with the person sharing it claiming that it came from a leak of internal Nickelodeon production files. The clip focused specifically on a moment from the episode often referred to by fans as the eels and escalators scene, and it claimed to reveal that when SpongeBob swears at this specific point in the episode, his original uncensored line was a specific curse phrase built around telling someone to blow him. For a while, this clip generated real excitement among fans who had been waiting years to hear any actual piece of the confirmed but still unreleased uncensored recording. However, the person who originally posted the clip eventually admitted that the audio had actually been edited together artificially, meaning the specific line included in the clip had been added afterward, rather than being genuine raw audio pulled from any real leaked recording. Despite this admission from the original source, the clip still spread widely, with many people online continuing to treat it as legitimate proof of the real, uncensored recording, simply because it fits so well with what Kenny, Bumpus, and Tibbitt had already confirmed to exist in general terms. This fake clip was eventually and fully debunked on December 4th, 2024, closing the loop on this particular piece of misinformation, though only after it had already spread widely enough that plenty of people likely still believe it represents something real. This situation mirrors, in a smaller way, the kind of confusion covered earlier regarding the reef blower rumor, where a piece of false information managed to spread widely and convincingly enough that separating fact from fiction eventually required required a direct, deliberate correction. There is one more detail worth including here that connects this entire story to something the franchise later did quite openly in full public view. The SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water, released years after this original episode, includes a rap battle sequence near its ending that features characters using language clearly meant to sound like real swearing, without technically crossing into actual curse words that would affect the film's rating. This creative choice appears to be a deliberate attempt to give audiences the impression of an authentic, edgy rap battle, borrowing from the same general idea explored back during the original Sailor Mouth recording session, where using real-sounding aggressive language, even without airing the literal, uncensored version, helps a scene feel more genuine and true to how people actually talk in that kind of heated moment. Taken together, this entire story sits in a genuinely rare category among lost media connected to this franchise. It is not simply a rumor invented and spread entirely by fans with no real basis in truth. Multiple separate members of the show's actual cast and crew, speaking independently across different years and different public events, have confirmed that this uncensored recording is real. One of them has confirmed personally owning a physical copy of it at some point. And yet, despite all of that direct, first-hand confirmation, the actual recording itself remains something the public has never legitimately heard, with at least one confirmed fake version already having spread widely enough to fool a large number of fans before eventually being exposed as an edited hoax rather than genuine leaked material. This leaves the uncensored Sailor Mouth tape sitting in an unusual in-between category compared to other pieces of lost media covered throughout this video. Unlike completely unconfirmed rumors that turned out to have no real basis at all, this recording is confirmed to exist, confirmed by multiple direct sources connected to the actual production, and even confirmed to have physically existed on a specific VHS tape owned by a specific person. But unlike media that has since been recovered and shared, even in a rough or lower quality form, this particular recording remains genuinely missing from public access, with its exact current location unknown, even to the very person who once had it sitting in his own home. The fact that a confirmed piece of the show's history can remain missing purely because one specific tape got misplaced somewhere over the years, despite 3 separate crew members openly discussing its existence across multiple public appearances, shows just how easily even fully documented material can slip away simply through the ordinary passage of time and the practical reality of physical media not always being carefully archived or tracked the way people might assume it would be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of a single missing tape connects to something much bigger happening behind the scenes of production in general, where plenty of finished, completed material never even makes it to the point of being aired at all, remaining buried in storage long before anyone outside the studio gets a chance to notice it is missing in the first place. Section 9. The Unmade. SpongeBob's birthday episode. Not every idea that gets pitched for a television show makes it anywhere close to production. Some concepts get killed almost immediately, right at the pitch stage, before a single storyboard is drawn or a single line of dialogue gets written down. One of the clearest documented examples of this kind of early rejection connected to SpongeBob SquarePants involves an episode that was planned during the show's second season, built around a birthday celebration for the main character himself, and shut down almost as soon as it was proposed by someone whose opinion carried real weight in the writer's room. During the development of Season 2, a working title for a planned episode simply called SpongeBob's Birthday came up as an idea within the writing team. The basic plot behind this proposed episode followed a fairly familiar structure that shows up across all kinds of television and movies, not just cartoons aimed at kids. SpongeBob would believe that his friends had completely forgotten his birthday, leading him to feel genuinely sad and hurt by what he assumed was their carelessness. As the story would eventually reveal, his friends had not forgotten at all. Instead, they had actually been secretly planning a surprise party for him the entire time, and his sadness throughout most of the episode would have been based on a misunderstanding that gets resolved once the surprise finally gets revealed near the end. This kind of story structure is instantly recognizable to almost anyone who has watched a decent amount of television before. The character believes they have been forgotten or overlooked by people who care about them, spends a stretch of the episode feeling genuinely down about it, and then discovers near the end that the people around them were actually planning something special all along, meaning the sadness the character felt felt throughout most of the story turns out to have been unnecessary once the full picture becomes clear. Sitcoms, cartoons, and family shows have used some version of this exact plot structure for decades across countless different shows and characters. This is precisely the problem that led to the idea getting killed before it ever moved forward. Jay Lender, the same storyboard artist whose direct account helped debunk the reef blower rumor covered earlier, was involved in evaluating this pitch during the show's early seasons, and he did not respond well to the concept at all. According to his own account of what happened, Lender genuinely disliked the idea, and he made his feelings about it clear directly to Steven Hillenburg, referred to informally as Steve by people who worked closely with him. Lender's specific concern was not a small, minor note about tweaking a few details here or there. His actual argument was much bigger than that. He believed that if the show ever produced an episode built around such a heavily familiar, overused premise, it would represent exactly the kind of creative decline that could mark the beginning of the end for the entire series. In his own words, recalling the conversation later, he told Hillenburg that the show would be over if they went ahead and produced something built around such a cliché idea. That is a striking level of concern to raise over what might sound, on the surface, like a fairly harmless, low-stakes birthday episode premise. But Lender's reaction reflects something important about how the show's creative team generally approached storytelling during its earliest and most celebrated seasons. SpongeBob SquarePants built its early reputation specifically by avoiding predictable, overused sitcom formulas that had already been done to death across countless other shows, instead leaning into stranger, more original, more visually inventive stories that did not rely on emotional plot structures viewers had already seen play out identically dozens of times before in completely different shows. A birthday episode built around the classic forgotten birthday, followed by a surprise party reveal, represented exactly the kind of predictable emotional beat the show's creative teams seemed determined to avoid during this specific stretch of its history. According to Lender's recollection, his rejection of the idea did not end the conversation entirely on its own. The premise apparently got passed along to other members of the writing team after his initial pushback, giving other people within the crew a chance to potentially pick up the idea and develop it further if they felt differently about its creative potential. Based on what Lender remembers, though, none of the other writers who received the pitch seemed particularly interested in moving forward with it either. Whether this reflects genuine independent agreement with Lender's original criticism, or simply a general lack of enthusiasm from people who had other ideas they were more excited to pursue instead, the end result was the same either way. The SpongeBob's birthday concept never advanced any further within the writing process, and it was eventually dropped entirely, joining the list of early season ideas that got pitched, discussed, and ultimately abandoned before ever reaching production. This gives a useful, concrete look into how creative decisions actually get made behind the scenes on a long-running animated show, especially during its formative early seasons, when the overall tone and creative identity of the series was still being actively shaped and protected by the people closest to it. A pitch does not need to be poorly written or completely without merit to get killed. Sometimes an idea gets rejected specifically because it feels too familiar, too safe, or too close to something audiences have already seen plenty of times elsewhere, especially when the people evaluating it are actively trying to build a show known specifically for doing things differently from typical children's programming of that era. The story does not end permanently with this early rejection, though, and this is where the situation becomes genuinely interesting from a lost media perspective, rather than simply being a small, forgotten footnote about one abandoned pitch. Many years later, during the show's 12th season, an actual episode celebrating SpongeBob's birthday finally did make it to air. This episode, titled SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout, was produced specifically to mark the show's 20th anniversary, giving it real significance as a milestone celebration built around the franchise's own long-running history, rather than simply being a random standalone birthday-themed episode dropped into the middle of an ordinary season. This means that roughly a decade after Jay Lender personally killed an early pitch, specifically because he felt a basic birthday episode premise was too predictable and cliché for the show to produce, the franchise eventually did make a birthday-themed milestone episode after all, just under very different creative circumstances, and with a very different level of significance attached to it. Rather than being a small, forgettable episode buried somewhere in an early season, built around a plot plot structure fans had already seen play out identically in countless other shows, this later version arrived specifically as a major anniversary celebration, giving the creative team a much stronger and more meaningful reason to actually tackle this kind of milestone occasion within the show's history. There is one more small detail connected to this story that adds an interesting extra layer to the whole situation. Even though the original Season 2 pitch itself never made it into the actual television series, the exact plot described in that abandoned pitch, involving SpongeBob believing his friends had forgotten his birthday, only to discover they were secretly planning a surprise party the entire time, did eventually find its way into official SpongeBob media after all, just through a completely different format than originally intended. A published book connected to the franchise, titled Happy Birthday SpongeBob, actually used this exact same basic plot structure as its own story. This means the idea itself was not thrown away entirely and forgotten forever after getting rejected for the television show. It simply found a different home, moving from being a rejected television episode pitch into becoming the basis for a children's book instead, released under the franchise's name, even though the concept never made it onto actual broadcast television the way it was originally intended. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it reveals something genuinely interesting about how creative material sometimes gets recycled and repurposed across different formats within a large media franchise, rather than simply being permanently discarded the moment it gets rejected in its original intended form. An idea considered too predictable and too cliché to represent the television series during its most creatively ambitious early seasons was apparently still considered perfectly acceptable and appropriate for use in a published children's book aimed at a slightly different context and a slightly different kind of audience engagement. Books based on established cartoon franchises often serve a somewhat different purpose than the actual television episodes themselves, sometimes leaning more directly into simple, familiar, easily understood story structures, precisely because they are aimed at younger readers who may benefit from a more straightforward, comfortable narrative, rather than the stranger, more unconventional storytelling the actual television series became known for using in its episodes. This means the SpongeBob's birthday concept has a somewhat unusual, split history compared to most other abandoned television pitches covered throughout this video. It was not simply killed and left completely unused anywhere within the wider franchise. It was killed specifically as a television episode concept, rejected directly by a key member of the creative team who felt strongly that using it would represent exactly the kind of predictable, tired storytelling the show was actively trying to avoid during that particular stretch of its history. Yet that same rejected plot still found an outlet elsewhere within the franchise's much wider media output, surviving in book form, even though it never made the jump into an actual broadcast episode using its original title. Taken together, this story offers a clear, well-documented look at how creative gatekeeping actually functions on a long-running animated show during its formative years. It shows that even a fairly simple, low-stakes idea, one built around a plot structure many other shows had already used plenty of times before, can get killed specifically because someone with real creative influence recognizes it as beneath the standard the show is actively trying to maintain. It also shows that ideas rejected in one specific format do not necessarily disappear forever from a franchise's history entirely. Sometimes they simply resurface later, whether through an entirely different creative team eventually revisiting a similar concept for a genuinely meaningful reason, like a milestone anniversary, or through the same basic plot finding a completely different home in another format, like a published book, released to a different kind of audience under different creative expectations than the original television pitch was ever held to in the first place. This particular piece of history stands apart from most of the earlier sections covered in this video because it does not involve any physical lost recording, missing storyboard, or vanished piece of media that needs to be tracked down or recovered from somewhere. Instead, it represents something quieter and less dramatic, a documented case of an idea being rejected at the earliest possible stage based purely on a creative judgment call made by someone directly involved in shaping the show's identity, and preserved today only through that same person's own retelling of what happened, along with the small, indirect echo of the same basic plot eventually surfacing years later in a completely different format under a completely different set of creative circumstances. Before we move on, if you're enjoying enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every version of a milestone celebration connected to this franchise has actually made it to air though, and one much more recent case involves a fully finished anniversary special that was scheduled, announced through an official press schedule, and then pulled at the very last moment for reasons that remain almost entirely unexplained, even now. Section 10. The Vanishing 2024 You Wish Anniversary Special. Most of the lost and unreleased material covered throughout this video involves things that happened years or even decades ago, pieces of history that fans have slowly pieced together over long stretches of time through old interviews, leaked storyboards, and recovered recordings. This final case is different because it happened recently, within the same year this video is being made, and it remains completely unresolved as of right now. Somewhere, sitting finished and ready, a brand new SpongeBob special exists that the public has still never been allowed to see. The special in question was built around You Wish, the same interactive event covered earlier in this video, the one that originally aired back in 2001, and let viewers vote by phone for which of 3 possible endings would become the official conclusion to that broadcast. Decades later, it appears Nickelodeon returned to this same concept, creating a new version of the special featuring brand new endings, different from the 3 original options fans voted on back in 2001. According to Nickelodeon's own press schedule, a document the network uses internally and shares with media outlets to announce upcoming programming, this new version of You Wish was specifically set to air on December 24th, 2024 at 5 o'clock in the evening. A press schedule is not some vague rumor or fan guess about what might be coming soon. It is an official planning document created by the network itself, meant to inform television listings, press coverage, and promotional planning ahead of an actual broadcast date. Having this special specifically named on that schedule with an exact date and an exact time attached to it represents about as strong and official a piece of confirmation as exists for any unreleased piece of media covered in this entire video. Despite this official scheduling, the special never actually aired on the date it was supposed to. Instead of the new You Wish special airing at its planned time slot, that spot ended up being filled by a premiere episode of The Patrick Star Show instead, specifically an episode called Day of the Living Dad Jokes. Later, another episode called Stuck in an Elevator also ended up airing in a similar replacement capacity around this same period. As of right now, there is no announced date for when or even if the originally planned You Wish anniversary special will actually reach the public. This kind of last-minute schedule change, where a fully planned and announced piece of programming quietly gets swapped out for something else entirely without any real public explanation, stands out as a fairly unusual occurrence, especially for something that had already reached the stage of appearing on an official press schedule with a specific date and time attached. Television networks do make schedule changes fairly often, for all kinds of reasons, but usually smaller adjustments involve shifting a program by a few days, or swapping similar types of content around. Removing a fully named, fully scheduled anniversary special entirely, without any announced replacement date at all, represents a much bigger and much stranger gap than a routine scheduling adjustment. Since Nickelodeon has not released any public statement explaining exactly why this specific special got pulled from its planned slot, almost everything known about its current status comes from indirect evidence rather than any official confirmation. The clearest piece of that evidence comes from an Instagram post made by Abril Aiello Fregoso, who worked as a background painter on this production. This post included an image of what is called a time card, a document used during animation production to track specific scenes and shots as they move through different stages of the animation process. This particular time card was specifically labeled with a production code, identifying it as belonging to this exact special. That production code carries some useful extra detail buried within it. According to how these codes are typically structured, this particular one indicates that the special was produced specifically as part of the 14th production season of the show, giving a clearer sense of exactly when this material was actually created behind the scenes, even though its intended broadcast date came years after that production work was actually completed. The special also apparently carried an official packaging number as well, another internal tracking detail used by the network to organize and catalog its programming, further reinforcing that this was a fully real, fully processed piece of content, moving through the network's normal production and scheduling systems, rather than some early, unfinished concept that never made it far enough along long to warrant this kind of official internal documentation. This single Instagram post from a background painter represents, as of right now, the only publicly available confirmation that this specific special genuinely exists in a finished or nearly finished form. Nickelodeon itself has not issued any statement confirming the special's existence, explaining its removal from the December 2024 schedule, or announcing any kind of future release date. Everything currently known publicly rests entirely on this one piece of evidence, shared not through any official studio channel, but through the personal social media account of someone who happened to work on a small piece of the production itself. This creates a genuinely unusual situation compared to most other cases covered throughout this video. In many of the earlier sections, confirmation eventually came directly from prominent, well-known figures closely associated with the show. People like Vincent Waller, Tom Kenny, Paul Tibbitt, or Jay Lender, each of whom held significant creative roles and had established public platforms where fans already expected to hear behind-the-scenes information from time to time. In this case, the only publicly available evidence traces back to a much less prominent member of the production team, someone working specifically on background art rather than occupying one of the more visible creative leadership roles that fans typically associate with official confirmations about the show's history. This does not make the evidence any less real or any less valid. A time card connected to an actual production code is a genuine piece of internal documentation, not the kind of thing someone could easily fake convincingly without direct access to the actual production files themselves. But it does mean that unlike several of the earlier cases in this video, where confirmation came through a direct, deliberate public statement specifically addressing a rumor or a piece of history, this particular piece of evidence surfaced somewhat quietly through a single social media post from someone who may not have even intended for it to become the primary piece of public evidence connected to an unreleased special. Taken together, what is actually confirmed here is fairly specific and fairly limited. A new version of the You Wish special, featuring different endings from the original 2001 broadcast, was scheduled to air on December 24th, 2024, according to Nickelodeon's own official press schedule. That air date came and went without the special actually airing, replaced instead by unrelated programming. A time card connected to a specific production code, shared publicly by a background painter who worked on the special, confirms that this project was produced during the 14th production season and carried an official internal packaging number. Beyond these specific documented details, no further public information currently exists explaining why the special was pulled, when or if it might eventually air, or what condition the finished material currently sits in behind the scenes at Nickelodeon. This leaves the 2024 You Wish anniversary special sitting in a strange, unresolved position, different from every other piece of history covered throughout this video. The earlier sections dealt with material that was either eventually recovered in some form, confirmed through direct crew statements addressing exactly what happened and why, or clearly explained through documented production decisions with a specific, understandable reason behind them. This final case offers none of that closure. There is no confirmed explanation for the removal. There is no announced future release date. There is only a confirmed original air date that quietly came and went, and a single piece of visual evidence from someone connected to the production, proving that whatever this special actually is, it was real enough to have its own time card, its own production code, and its own place on an official broadcast schedule before disappearing from public view without any further word. Whatever ends up happening to this specific special, whether it eventually gets released the way the original 200th episode replacement eventually found its way onto air through a different avenue entirely, or whether it simply continues sitting unreleased indefinitely the way the scrapped SpongeBob Invader Pants episodes have for years now, this case stands as a reminder that lost and unreleased material connected to this franchise is not only a story about the distant past. Even now, in the present, finished pieces of SpongeBob history continue slipping quietly out of public view, sometimes with barely any explanation at all, beyond a single social media post from someone who happened to have worked on a small piece of something the rest of the world has still never gotten the chance to see. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.